I call Denise Roche.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take the first call for the Greens on the Employment Standards legislation bill. Sir, after quite a lot of debate within our caucus, we will be opposing this bill to Select Committee. We do recognise that there are some really good stuff, there's some really good aspects to it. And what we would have liked to have seen was a bit more positive stuff before we could give our support to Select Committee. That's not to say, though, that we won't be actively participating in the Select Committee process to try and amend the things that we disagree with in order to have a bill that we could agree with, maybe on the second reading, sir. The things that we like, which fit with the Green co-up, are around extending paid parental leave, the stronger enforcement of existing employment standards, the introduction of higher penalties at the employment court and greater power being given to labour inspectors. But the fact is, sir, that with this bill, as it's written, it has the potential to legitimise zero-hour contracts and actually make the situation around zero-hour contracts and insecure work even worse. And on balance, we can't support that. Let me start by describing one of the key purposes of the bill, which is to extend the paid parental leave scheme. We're great supporters of paid parental leave. Our policy is to extend it to 13 months leave, and it was excellent to hear the Chair of the Transport and Industrial Relations Committee talk about the benefits of paid parental leave. We also support Sue Moroney's member's bill for 26 paid parental leave, and I want to acknowledge the fact that the amendments that David Seymour has been able to make is as the result of the last bill around paid parental leave being 26 weeks that she brought to this House, and the amendments and compromises she made in an effort to get it through and failed. So we acknowledge that these aspects of this bill are good and we would be supporting them. But, and I'd like to move now to the stronger enforcement of employment standards. We absolutely support this too. According to the Statistics New Zealand 2012 survey of working life, about 1 in 5 working New Zealanders was not receiving at least some of the minimum standards that we currently have. Now, from our perspective, this bill does 3 main things that support stronger enforcement of minimum standards, and that is 1, giving labour inspectors more powers to apply for orders from the employment court in cases of breaches. The second one is creating robust definitions of what constitutes breaches of employment standards, and the third thing is the higher penalties that the employment court can bring. We support all these changes because basically we support working people having a fair go. However, while the legislation does provide labour inspectors with more tools to deal with problems, the legislation is only one of the steps we can take. And while I acknowledge that the Labour Inspectorate do a really good job and has received more funding than recently, it's still insufficient to police the sadly too common problem of labour abuse. And sir, in previous years and previous times, we've had unions that did compliance work, so it didn't fall simply to labour inspectors. A classic example, sir, is today's paper, the New Zealand Herald, reporting on the Masala restaurant who had abused and underpaid workers for 5 years between 2009 and 2014, with the most egregious being a worker who was paid $2.64 an hour to work a 66-hour week. The question is, how has it taken 5 years for this tragic work environment and breaches of minimum standards to come to light? And our inspectors do work very hard, but there's not nearly enough of them. We've got, currently in New Zealand, we've got 1 labour inspector for 53,658 New Zealanders, compared to Australia, where they have better employment standards, and one of the reasons is because of the compliance. They have one labour inspector to 19,130 Australians. And the employment relations climate that this government has created through its imbalanced and disproportionate favouring of employers, from the Hobbit Bill to the provisions in this bill which legitimise zero-hour contracts, it means that workers are afraid to speak out, so there is far more work for labour inspectors to do. So while I do applaud the positive provisions in this bill that allow for stronger enforcement, it seems to be a hollow gesture in light of how under-resourced the Labour Inspectorate is. Now, nowhere can be seen in this bill, the climate of fear that, that has been pervasive throughout the industrial relations environment in New Zealand as a result of the changes that I've just referred to that this government has made, has created this climate of fear. And the best example of how that plays out is zero-hour contracts. And like the Health and Safety Reform Bill, it appears that National has capitulated to vested interests, although they've done it at the start of the process this time instead of at the end, in providing very weak provisions around it. There are some quite obvious flaws, and I hope they're not deliberate flaws, in this part of the bill. The first flaw is that it requires employment arrangements to contain only an indication of the arrangement relating to the times that the employee is to work, and it's a very weak clause. And the CTU have rightly pointed out that it doesn't contain any provisions for a minimum notice period for an arrangement. And actually, workers need at least a week's notice so that they can plan their lives. The second flaw around zero-hour contracts is the availability clause. And the key problem of this is that the bill does say that there must be payment of compensation, but it doesn't actually define what that is. And this could be just something as simple as 50 cents an hour. And we think that is unreasonable, and there should be a minimum defined compensation payment. Furthermore, while we applaud the intention of the bill that employers must not treat employees adversely for refusing to undertake additional work, we know from experience that this law will regularly be flouted, and that the overworked and under-resourced labour inspectors won't be able to do much about it. The power imbalance exists in many industries that use zero-hour contracts, and the lack of definition around compensation means that I am afraid that workers will be bullied into signing broad availability clauses, which basically undermines the home deal. And the third area is around shift cancellation. And this is actually worse than the status quo, where workers can actually be entitled to be paid for the cancellation of shifts. But like the availability clauses, there's no minimum compensation and there's no test for reasonableness. So, Mr. Speaker, I guess just my final comment is around the departmental disclosure statements, which actually said that they tested some of these proposals and that Business New Zealand indicated that they were comfortable with the approach. And I think it summarises the lack of balance in this legislation, that the government is happy to consult with Business New Zealand, but they haven't actually taken on board the other side of the story, which would have been represented by the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. We are deeply saddened that we cannot support this bill. We will be following it through the Select Committee process. If there are major improvements in the areas that I've outlined here, then we would probably reconsider. And so I hope that we will have a good relationship and a good discussion when we come to the Select Committee. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. I call Clayton Mitchell.